Marvelous. So we'll rewind slightly. Sarah, welcome. Um, we're very glad to have you here today. Is there anything you'd like to start by telling us about who you are and what you do?
Um, no, I'm excited to be here and a little bit about my background. I, like you said, am a user researcher and an experience designer. I did that and I still do that. That's how I got into this industry in the early 2000s or so. Um, and then in about 2017, kind of the researcher in me noticed this problem around a lot of people asking me for advice and feedback on their portfolios. And I was not doing career coaching at the time. And honestly, I would put those emails in a folder and intend to reply and never reply because there was just so many of them. Um, and long story short, I put together a class about portfolios in 2017 and it sold out. Then people got hired. And I thought, I think I'm onto something. And so that's how I guess, knowingly slash unknowingly, use my research and design skills to then create this world of career coaching that is under this umbrella of Career Strategy Lab. So that's kind of my unique career story in a quick nutshell.
Thank you so much. That's, really interesting to hear about like using those research muscles to think about a different problem in the world. And I think we'll probably touch on that a few times where you can use these research muscles in different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the as I said, you're welcome to use the chat throughout, folks, and ask questions. But we'll start by introducing some talking points. So the way that we thought about this is to think about different parts of a journey of searching for jobs and how you might split those up. So I'm going to start by thinking about the UX job market, leveraging LinkedIn and the professional identity or personal brands that people might need to build as UX designers. So, what are your current impressions, Sarah, of the UX job market internationally?
Um, it's not as bad as everyone thinks, first of all. And I say that because despite even yesterday seeing these announcements of Meta doing a layoff, and I don't know the exact details because I haven't read the article yet, but I think there will always be a lot of press and coverage when big tech companies are doing layoffs. And at the same time, there are so many companies hiring outside of these, big tech industries. And so I think, we're in this vacuum of LinkedIn and we see a lot of negative doom and gloom type posts and things. And yes, the job market is not easy, but I think it's just so important to remember that there's so many companies and industries that need our skills and expertise. And if you can expand your or widen your job search, maybe to industries you had never considered, I think you'll find there's lots of great opportunities. And also, based on what I hear from people who get hired at industries they hadn't considered, like someone who went and worked at an energy company, I think it was kind of an oil and gas or something. They'd never considered working in that industry, but they ended up with a role that allowed them a lot more opportunities for career advancement and, in paraphrasing their words, a better quality and balance between work and life than kind of the hustle culture of a lot of the big tech companies. So that's kind of my high level. I'm happy to answer follow-ups on, more around the global UX job market.
Yeah, I think we may well have some thoughts on that. I think it also links quite well to the next question, which is about any trends that you might have observed in technology more broadly and what you feel has legs. What's going to take off? What's the next thing in UX?
Mm-hmm. Um, so I have a podcast episode about this and an article, and I'm going to take a lot of notes during this session so I can remember to curate links to all of these things I'm going to mention. But I think in terms of specific industries that I'm seeing companies hiring for now, my perspective is obviously skewed because I see a lot of jobs in North America. However, I imagine if I did some research, I think some of these industries are true globally. So one of them is finance. That could be banks, that could be investment firms, that could be specific like finance related software and apps and things like that. But I see one company here, JP Morgan Chase, like constant, almost every day, I see them posting jobs, or I see people who work there saying their team is hiring. So I think finance is a great industry to look at. Um, I think travel is a really great industry to be looking at, especially after, we're coming out of the pandemic and more people are traveling. It seems like we're seeing a lot of people get hired. We have someone from Career Strategy Lab who got hired at Delta Airlines, I believe, as their first UX writer, which was pretty cool. But I even see companies like cruise lines, for example. And when I think of UX, I don't think of cruises. But when you think about it, there's a lot of UX that needs to be involved in that, right? There's probably apps for when you're on the boat and before you depart and all the booking. It's, lots of complexity there. Plus, if you think of the behind the scenes software that teams and employees on the ship must use, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of very interesting UX there. So travel, whether it's airlines, cruises. The other thing that I see a lot are kind of travel companies and maybe tour groups. So I'm seeing a lot of, at least here, kind of startups or companies I've never heard about who do group travel. And I think, and again, I've not done formal research. This is me just connecting dots in my brain, but I think that part of it is because coming during the pandemic, we all got kind of isolated and lonely, right? And I think people are having trouble re-socializing, let's say. And so I'm seeing a lot of travel companies specifically around like group travel for solo travelers, let's say. So travel is another industry. I'll stop going into the details of all that one. Health is another one. I think whether it's software that powers electronic medical records, for example, software related to insurance. So a lot in the health industry. And I'll mention four. The fourth one, I think, is education, because there's so much push to, first of all, remote learning, but also just learning in general, right? We have, Masterclass, Udemy, Khan Academy, all these places, let alone the software that elementary schools, high schools, colleges, universities, et cetera, use to deliver their remote or just content in general. I think that's going to grow a lot also. But in this article and podcast that we'll link to, I give some specific job boards to that allow you to filter and like narrow down by industry. So hopefully that'll give people a starting place to kind of just get out of this, big tech FANG mindset.
I think that
And
sounds so useful because anytime you can find sort of active job boards, it's very helpful. And I think you can also end up in a bit of a doom spiral with LinkedIn to a certain
mhm.
extent, and it does tend to pull up the same jobs again and again. So it's like so much of what you've just said has resonated. Finance, for sure, definitely seem to have more roles coming up in the UK for certain.
Mm.
Yeah. How
And
about in Stockholm? Are you seeing the similar patterns? Oh, Sarah, what were you going to say?
I was just going to mention the little example I gave before we came live because I think it's so timely and interesting. So I was reading an article about these devastating fires in Los Angeles, and the article was about how the fire teams use this software on a tablet. And so there's teams like out in the mountains where the fires are in towns. And then there's like fire directors, whatever they're called, that are using software to tell the teams on the fire where to go. So when I read this, I thought, wow, like, what is this software? I need to learn more about this. But I think it's just such a great example of like being aware in everyday life, listening to, news or reading articles, etc., and just like collecting ideas of where UX, which industries could be hiring, because I've never thought about the UX of software that is used in fires and natural disasters, but I kind of want to go work at that company. It's so fascinating to me. So, yeah, just being more aware and mindful of what you're absorbing every day too gives you clues of industries that you never would have considered, let alone known about, right?
Yeah, definitely. And as someone who's like been a UXer in a lot of different situations that have been non-traditional UX situations, like for example, working with people functions in
Mm.
organizations, totally resonates. Yeah, a really good point. Um, and what are your thoughts on the many changes to job titles within UX and product? Do titles matter?
Um, Everyone gets hung up on titles. I will say that. Like it just becomes this hurdle for so many people. And I think it's one of those things where you just have to accept the fact that titles mean something different at so many companies. And so you kind of need to let go of like, you must be hired with a senior in your title or a director or a lead or something, because that means different things at a small startup versus Amazon. Like I was, I don't know, I forget how old I was, like 25 or something, and I was given the title of director of product development for this startup. Well, there was like five people in the company and no product. So that, was a great title, but it was kind of meaningless. If I had then gone to apply to a job at Google, because they'd look at that director title and be like, you weren't really directing anything, So I think not getting too hung up on these titles. Um, and this is really important in your job search. And I know job descriptions are not written clearly a lot of the time, but that's why it's so important to read the job description and not decide if you're going to apply for a role solely based on the job title. Um, so it's one of those things where it would be great if job titles were standardized everywhere, but that's just not the reality we live in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think really helpful feedback is yeah, not get too hung up on these things and sort of thinking about something that people frequently get quite hung up on is where should you list your specialisms on your LinkedIn profile to have the most impact?
Yes. Okay. So if you only make one update to your LinkedIn profile today, you need to go update. It's called the headline, or last I checked, it's called the headline, the text below your name, because you have to think of your LinkedIn profile like a web page that you are trying to SEO optimize, and you're trying to optimize it for what recruiters and hiring managers are typing into LinkedIn when they're searching for candidates. And so there's many parts of the profile that LinkedIn is looking at when a recruiter types UX researcher. And that headline is really, really important. The next part would be the about section, where you can have quite a lot of text. I'm not sure the exact character limit, but those would be the two things. And then if I had to add a third, I would say in your work history, don't just list, the company. Take the time to fill in some bullet points that you're probably just going to cut and paste from your resume. But if you only do one, update that headline, because if you don't, LinkedIn will just default it to your current job title and company. And when you think about the user experience of LinkedIn and where that headline shows up, there's sirens. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but we have where does that LinkedIn headline live? Obviously on your profile, but notice on LinkedIn, when people comment, that headline is below their name. In the right column where it recommends people, that headline is there. So if that headline is specific and interesting and doesn't sound like everyone else's headline, people might click you, you know? So that is why the headline is so important.
And I've just started a game in the chat, Sarah, inspired by your suggestion, where I think people should share their headlines. So
Yes.
I'm putting mine in to get the ball rolling and see if anyone else does it.
And I'm making a
Fantastic.
note to find a video or podcast that I did about LinkedIn headlines. So, and then I,
Brilliant. Yes, please. We'd love to hear about that. And the next question I have, and it's my final question before I pass over to Thais, is how can I tailor my responses during interviews to be considered regardless of the role's level, especially when companies seem unsure about what they're looking for? So this was a question submitted by Brighton.
all right, I'm just rereading it because I have the questions up on my screen also. All right, so in the interview to tailor your responses, I think in order to tailor a response or like think about tailoring a user experience, we have to know a little bit about that user, customer, stakeholder, whomever, right? So we can give them the most relevant information to their situation. So, how do you tailor responses during an interview? It starts with really listening to what the interviews are asking of you. And in every step of the interview process, whether it is a phone call, an email, etc., like being very mindful, treating it like a research project and gathering information to think, okay, in that last interview, they mentioned this area of the product that's troublesome right now. Maybe when they ask you a question in the interview, you're able to pull an example of something you worked on that is similar to that area of the product. Like if it's e-commerce and they're having problems with their checkout and you worked on e-commerce, maybe you talk about some checkout experience that you worked on. Now, that's not always possible, of course, but I think in general, when you're responding to interview questions, it's really important to lead with examples. So don't just say like, "Oh yeah, I have experience doing usability tests." Instead, say like, "And in my last role," and then insert example of usability tests you did. You know, I was responsible for doing usability testing for the onboarding of new customers in a product that had, I don't know, 30,000 monthly users or whatever. You know, doesn't have to be a whole like paragraph, but just a simple sentence like that means a lot more than just like saying, oh yeah, I've been doing usability testing for 5 years. That's nice, but it's better to hear an example.
Yeah, that idea of having tangible examples, and also your point there about it's almost like I always think it's like an impact equation in the sense
Mm,
that you want to think how many people and
yes.
what do you have a measurable outcome? You know, by what percentage was the usability improved? Even
Yep.
if it's a small percentage, that can actually be a big deal. So yeah, that's super helpful.
And one other thing I would add to that is that in those examples that you'll give, it's really a great opportunity to also mention software you have experience in. So, you know, you've been doing usability testing and you have experience and you've used software XYZ or whatever it was. And that's a great opportunity to just slip in, you know, these examples of software in case they haven't read your resume, for example.
Very good point. Very good point. And I'm going to pass you over to Thais now, who's going to take us through the next set of questions, which are related to transitioning in UX from other disciplines.
All right.
Welcome again. Yeah, so we know a big part of our community is also people transitioning from other disciplines, people that coming from maybe education, maybe from like they were like nurses, they were doctors, psychologists, you name it. So my first question about that is like for designers starting out, where should they put their energy if they are transitioners?
Yeah. So when you're switching into user experience from another industry, I think one of the most strategic things you can do is think about how do you leverage that previous experience. So let's go with that nurse example. Um, you might want to focus your job search on getting hired in some health related industry. And the reason for this is that sure, there may be other candidates that have 3 years of experience that apply to the same job as you. However, not all of those candidates will have 10 years of experience as a nurse, for example. And so, if as a switcher, if you focus your energy on getting hired in the industry you already have experience in, I think it's going to be a lot easier because let's say I work at the, health insurance company or something doing UX. I want to hire the person who has experience in healthcare because it's really difficult to get someone up to speed in all the details and regulations and nuance in the healthcare industry, for example. And especially if you come from an industry that's quite complex or highly regulated, like healthcare, for example, that previous experience that you have, I think, is even more valuable because hire someone with 3 years of experience, but none in healthcare, it's going to take them a lot longer to get up to speed on really important details and knowledge of that industry. And I know many people want to switch careers because they want to get out of their industry because they're burnt out as a nurse, for example. However, I think you have to think of it as like a strategic short-term move that's going to get you in the door to user experience. And then 18 months, 3 years from now, you take a UX job that is outside of the healthcare industry if that's what you want. But I think just recognizing the immense value of that knowledge that you have of an industry can be so valuable in helping you stand out from other people who don't have that experience.
Thank you. As a transitioner, I appreciate. Yeah, you mentioned about 3 years of experience. So my next question is related to that. How can I get hired in a big company with less than 3 years of experience?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that last question and maybe ensuring that the story that's being told across your resume, your portfolio, your LinkedIn, cover letters, for example, any touch point that you have with people, you really want to be reinforcing and selling really the prior experience you have. And I hear this all the time from hiring managers where, they anecdotally speak of situations where they had candidates with various years of experience apply. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to like the quality of that person's ability to articulate their skills and experience. And, someone with 1 year of experience, if they do a better job at communicating that across all those resume, portfolio, et cetera, they're going to stand out from someone with 3 years of experience whose portfolio is kind of just screenshots with no context and resume bullet points that kind of aren't outcome oriented, et cetera. So I think this 3 years of experience is kind of this mythical number that floats around social media that I think a lot of people just latch onto as an obstacle to getting hired. But based on, the people we see get hired who are in my career strategy lab program and just anecdotally stories I see on LinkedIn that people are posting, it really does come down to just the quality or your ability to tell your story and communicate your value. Because I think recruiters and hiring managers also kind of recognize, even though years of experience is listed in the job description, it's kind of this arbitrary thing that just gets thrown into job descriptions. But when they're deciding who gets an interview or not, I don't think, every hiring manager is just deciding based on number of years of experience.
Yeah, super relevant. Yeah, I go now to my next and last question in this block. You mentioned about approaching other industries like finance, banks. Our next question is like how to approach business from industries where UX is not very developed.
Yeah, I think that first of all, it just involves becoming aware of those industries, right? And I think it partially just goes back to kind of being more mindful in our everyday lives. And when we read an article about the fires and the software, we're like, wait a second, I never would have thought of that. Let me do a quick search and see, what comes up. And what when I do that, and I'm sure this happens to many of you, like it turns into kind of this what's the right word? Almost like treasure hunt. That's the wrong word, but like you Google one thing and then you're on to the next and then you're on to the next. It's like an adventure on Google. So I think allowing space to do that is really important. But I think in terms of approaching them, I guess maybe that question is more framed at pursuing freelance work with those industries, do you think?
Maybe.
Approaching the business from industries. Yeah, like if it was freelance, for example, I think part of it it involves developing relationships with people at those companies, because this brings us into a topic that all job seekers face, which is like, no one responds to my cold emails. What's the point in emailing people if no one responds, etc.? Well, I have a podcast episode about this, but the gist of it is by creating relationships with people before you cold email them, that cold email is no longer cold, it's warm or lukewarm. So you always need to be thinking about like, which companies might I want to apply to in the future, for example, and then intentionally engaging on LinkedIn with people who work at those companies so that 3 months from now, 6 months from now, if they post that they're hiring and you reply to them, you're not some stranger in the comments, but they recognize your face or your name, or you've, had a couple of touch points where you're just no longer a cold person. And this isn't just specific to the job search. Like this is kind of sales 101. And I'm doing this right now. I have some partnerships I really want to pull off in 2025. And instead of just sending a pitch deck to people at these places, I'm finding people who work at these companies and I'm engaging with them and I'm having little conversations in the comments of LinkedIn or on LinkedIn messages, so that, you're kind of like priming the pump, if you will, so that when the moment does seem right to have a more formal discussion and present this presentation that I ultimately want to show them and how we could work together, I'm not this cold person, but I'm like this person they already know, and they're more likely to say yes. So hopefully that answers that question, or at least gives some tips for networking and relationships in the job search.
I think it's super relevant. I don't know if in Brighton it's also like that, but I notice in Stockholm it's quite big. Networking is super key for a job hunt. So it's very, very relevant.
And can I add one more thing about
Yes,
that? Because if you want to apply to a certain company, it's on your list of dream companies, for example, The other reason why it's so important to like connect and follow people who work at that company on LinkedIn is so often people on those teams or the hiring managers will post that their team is hiring. And if you're not connected to them or following them, you won't see that post. So it's not just about commenting and messaging them, it's about increasing the chances that you see that that company is hiring because someone from the team or the hiring manager posts about it on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now I'll pass to Luciana, and the next block is about staying motivated, handling rejection, and building confidence.
Mm.
Yeah, that has been really hard nowadays, I think, with like the market as it is. Sarah, we have heard from folks that they received a lot of rejections or worse, hear nothing back at all. What advice would you give to people who feel like they are in a rejection echo chamber?
Yep. This is one of those answers that is just kind of real talk, to be honest. And the reality is, rejections are just part of the job search. And so, this is where I think it's important that you remember it's there are so many reasons why you may not have been invited for the interview. And you need to not take it personally. You need to develop some resilience and just keep moving forward. And I know that's easy to say, right? But I think that, especially when you think of things from the recruiter or hiring manager's perspective, if they post a role and 2, 3, 400 people apply, it's highly likely they're not going to go through all 400 to then determine who gets the initial 15-minute call with HR, for example. And this is not a function of them being unfair or anything. It's a numbers game. Like if you have 400 applications and you spend 10 minutes on each application, that's a lot of hours. And if you are hiring for multiple roles, let's say you have 3 roles, 3 times 400, that's a lot of hours of 10-minute vetting of each person. So we have to think of their experience because likely they might be going through only 100, and it could be just who applied first. Maybe their hiring software is doing some, estimated prioritization, let's say, of candidates, etc. So that's one thing to remember. The other thing to remember, let's see, the rejected and kind of the ghosting. And I think the other question that comes up with this is feedback and candidates. We all see the posts on LinkedIn where candidates love to say like how frustrating it is to not receive feedback. And the same answer that I just gave applies, right? Like if we sit down and do the math, that is a lot of hours for recruiters. And also the recruiting industry has seen a lot of layoffs, not just in UX, but in general. I just read this article the other day about how they've been hit with a lot. So the other reason that we have to remember that you can't always be provided with feedback, there's legal reasons, right? Many companies just can't and don't provide feedback to CYA, essentially, cover their butts, essentially. So that's another reason why. And I think it is frustrating as a candidate to get rejected, et cetera, but you just kind of have to like accept it and move on. And resilience, I feel like someday I'll write a book about resilience, but I don't know if that's helpful, or at least it helps bring everyone to some like reality on why these things just can't happen. Despite, sure, it would be a great experience if everyone could get a custom reply with suggestions of how to improve, but that's unrealistic, And anyone that's done hiring, there's probably some of you here can probably relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, while searching for a job, what are the most impactful activities to work on alongside our job hunt?
Mm. If I could only choose one right now, it's relationships. It's really fostering and nurturing relationships with people at companies where you want to work, because so many jobs are found because you saw someone post that their team is hiring, for example, found and filled because of relationships. And so I think networking often has this kind of negative feeling attached to it. I don't even really like the word. I try and always remember to say like building relationships, because networking often feels so transactional. And I think if we can be really intentional with creating these relationships, then people are going to be more likely to remember us. Like, I am on the receiving end of a lot of transactional emails and LinkedIn messages where it's like this stranger messages me and says, "Hey, I see you know so and so. Can you introduce me to them? You know, because they're hiring." And I don't know this person. Like, I've never interacted with the person that asked me for the favor. I don't know anything about their skills, right? So if you're planning to apply, I don't know, at some airline or bank or something, make sure you're trying to form relationships and become more visible to people who work there, because then they're going to get to know you. Maybe you're posting about some research project you did on LinkedIn or sharing insights, et cetera. And they start to have this understanding like, oh, Jane is that person who always posts about research. And then, you are no longer a stranger. So relationships, so key. I think the other thing, and it kind of overlaps with relationships, but being intentional about what you post on LinkedIn. And I know this topic of personal brand and LinkedIn and all this comes up quite a bit. And I want to reassure everyone that to get hired, you don't need to be a LinkedIn influencer that posts 5 times a day with these beautiful carousel posts and tips and all this stuff. That is not necessary. However, be very mindful about what you're posting on LinkedIn, because 2 or 3 points here. Number one, a lot of people recently seem to be treating LinkedIn like a journal where they air all their grievances and like, oh no, another rejection, woe is me type thing. And sure, like those feelings are valid, but don't post them on LinkedIn, because if I'm a hiring manager and I come to your LinkedIn profile and it's just like a wall of negativity, I'm going to think to myself, like, I don't want that energy on my team. And so being very mindful about that, number one. But on the flip side, what should you post on LinkedIn? If you're applying for, say, researcher roles, aim to be posting research related content. Like, you might have other things you want to post, and that's great, but you have to stay like on topic to use those posts as an opportunity to showcase your skills and expertise and interest and curiosity in whatever field and role you want to get hired for. So it doesn't mean you need to start a newsletter and write 2,000 word articles every week. It's like, oh, you listen to a podcast, you write 2 sentences of takeaways from the podcast and you link to it. Versus what a lot of people do is just like put the link to the podcast and there's no commentary. Like, just by pulling out a few insights and nuggets or takeaways from an article or a podcast or something, that is a very easy way to post on LinkedIn, and potentially start a conversation. Like, even today, after this event, there's probably 1 or 2 takeaways. You can use this event as like a prompt, if you will, to then just go post 1 or 2 things like, this Q&A was cool if you think it was, and here's 1 or 2 things I'm going to do today. So yeah, that's my spiel on personal branding, LinkedIn, etc.
Thank you, Sarah. Really valid tips. And my last question from the section is, How to reach a higher level of confidence to land a job in UX? Do you have any tips for that?
Ooh, this is a good one because it happens so often. And we deal with confidence every single week, maybe every single day inside our community for Career Strategy Lab. But I think if I try and like think of the trends around where the root of confidence often is, I think it often goes back to people not spending enough time thinking about what they did in their previous roles. And when you have a resume that only kind of scratches the surface of what you did, then when you read it, you're like, oh, I sound like I can do my job, but I'm not amazing, versus when you take the time to create a resume that is not scratching the surface, that is talking about not just what you did, but why you did it, how you did it, what happened, what was the impact. The very act of writing that strong resume or UX case studies, in the experience that I see with people in Career Strategy Lab, they quite often say, and I'm paraphrasing, but wow, after redoing my resume or rewriting my UX case studies, it showcases my skills and abilities, and like it extracted the details that were missing in the original versions. And now I, as a professional, feel a lot more confident in my skills and experience. So I think confidence is this thing that a lot of people kind of think they're just going to wake up and confidence will strike them or something. But confidence is kind of a byproduct of having a stronger resume, having a stronger portfolio, et cetera. That's what we see week after week with people, who are doing what we teach. So I think even if you don't feel confident, you just have to start. Like, it's like running marathons. I've run marathons, and my first one, did I feel confident I could run 26 miles? No. But if I had have waited until I felt confident, I would have never run the marathon, right? The confidence to run 26.2 miles comes from running multiple times every week and building up, because every Saturday you increase like the mileage more and more. I'll spare you the details, but that's where the confidence comes from, right? So yes.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sarah. Now I will pass the mic to Fiona, and she's going to continue with some topics, questions about staying relevant and continuous growing. Thank you.
Awesome.
Now, I'm conscious of how much time we have left, and we've got lots of lovely questions from the chat that have come through. So I'm going to keep my section deliberately short, and I'm going to ask you two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, what tips do you have for planning your onward career?
Planning your onward career. Okay, I'm going to write this one down because I know I have multiple things here. Planning your career slash. Okay, first of all, we need to treat it like a product. So I have this philosophy that the greatest product you're ever going to work on is you, also known as the product of you. So to develop that product of you or us, we kind of just need to turn to what we do in product development, right? And think about like, what is our vision? What is our purpose? What are our goals? And how do we sequence the steps every day, every week, every month in our career to get us closer to that? I know that was really vague, but one of the things that I think is really important, and we did this exercise in this annual review I taught last week, but think of a page with 3 columns, and there's 3 questions I want you to ask yourself. On the left, it's where am I now? So maybe that's skills, maybe that's strengths, maybe that's underutilized skills, maybe one of the things is like, I hate my boss, or I hate my company, or I love my boss. Do like a brain dump of where are you now? And then at the right, in that column, the 3rd column, write down where do you want to be in the future, right? So like, I want to be a director or managing people or not managing people or whatever, right? Or, big company, small company, this, that, write all that down. And then in the middle, the most important question we need to answer is in the middle, which is, what is stopping me? And so you kind of like look at the left, where am I now? Look at the right, where do I want to be? And make a list of all the stuff that's stopping you. And the next part is key. The list of things that are stopping you, you then have to like X out all the things that are not in your control, right? The job market is saturated. Recruiters don't read resumes. Like, X out all the things that are not in your control. And then you have this list of things that could be goals or action steps, depending on what they are. And that helps you prioritize, okay, where should I focus my time and energy based on where I said I want to go? So hopefully that could be a whole workshop, I guess, for maybe another event, but it's a great exercise to do. Like, even I do it like on a new project, if I do consulting with other companies, just to kind of understand, okay, what problem are we solving? Where are we now? Where do we want to go? What's stopping us? So that would be the best tip. I see, Fiona, you typed it in, so thank you.
Yeah, I always like to have it so that people can just paste it into notebooks or something.
Yes.
That's such amazing advice, and I'm actually gonna probably try it on a contract soon as well.
It's
See how
so
it goes. Thank
valuable
you.
for, yeah, just extracting information out of people. You could like put it in a Miro board or use Post-its. Like, it could be a cool workshop activity also.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna skip to the last question in my section, which is,
Okay.
if you could go back in time and give past Sarah a message, what would you tell her?
Oh, goodness. Okay, the one that pops into my head right now is start before you're ready and don't procrastinate. And here's the example. So I was working at a startup when I lived in New York City, and it's a startup. There's politics and frustration and everything. And we were at the holiday party at this really nice location overlooking Central Park. And I just remember thinking to myself, if I'm at this party again next year, like, I'm a big failure because I didn't get out of this company. And where was I the next year? At the same party, at the same location, having another holiday party with the startup. And so I wish I had not let myself stay in this company that was just kind of not moving me forward, that I was stuck in, et cetera. And I was caught up on so many details of where I would go and what I would do and this and that. But I wish I had focused less on like trying to make it work or what could go wrong, and just made a leap somewhere. I know that's not possible for everyone, but yeah, that's the one that pops into my head.
It's a great example, and it's always, yeah, it's always, you have a level of hindsight, but at the same time, it tells you like, okay, let's try and do this differently
Yeah.
next time.
Like, what did I spend 12 months doing between year after year, And I think there's probably elements of confidence that weren't there. I think there was elements of overthinking that weren't there. And I think it was also, I was spending so much time caught up in the gossip and drama of the startup that I did not have the time or energy to do the 3-column activity that we just talked about. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, if you don't have the time and energy to reflect, I think that that's quite a big giveaway that you're kind of overworked and under-resourced in yourself.
Yes.
So we'll move on to the chat questions, which we've been
Okay.
collating in a document. So the first question is from Anya. If I'm only a graduate yet, but I want to be a CX/UX researcher and have no experience, what could I write in my LinkedIn headline, do you think?
Great. Okay, what do we have so far? Maybe you can paste that in so we can have something to start with. But I think that you're a student. I'm going to assume you don't have like some prior career. I would definitely have the word user researcher in there, or UX researcher for sure. And then I would think about, are there specific industries or types of products you're interested in? Because that LinkedIn headline could say something like UX researcher interested in, healthcare or finance or whatever. Other things, other variables, I guess we could say, that could go into the LinkedIn headline. Areas of interest. So like maybe you are really interested in the more qualitative or the quantitative parts of research. So, or mixed methods. Sometimes I see like mixed methods, user researcher focused on qualitative, et cetera. So those are things you could do. Also, your education, like if put your degree or specialty in that headline, I think that can be very valuable. And I'm seeing you have something like recent graduate from Bachelor of Sociology. Yeah, I would put like UX researcher with a degree in psychology, interested in XYZ, focused on XYZ, curious about fintech or something like that, because the fintech or the industries is going to help in that search factor when they're typing in, right? And so that's where you would start. The thing with LinkedIn headlines, and people overthink these so much, like you can change it 10 times a day. So don't overthink this, like my holiday party example, and update it today, tomorrow, let it sit for like a week or two and see what happens. You might notice that people start reaching out to you, because here's a great example that just popped into my mind. Thank goodness. We had someone who updated their LinkedIn profile because they realized that they wanted to focus on STEM in their next job. So they added STEM to their LinkedIn headline and their about section. And what happened? Some recruiter reached out to them about a STEM role. I forget if it was research or design. A recruiter reached out. They had an interview. It was a very quick process and they got hired. Why? Because number one, they got clear on that STEM focus and they optimized that LinkedIn profile to communicate that. So people were finding them, which is so valuable. I think that's enough for that one, unless there's a follow-up.
No, it's brilliant. And
Okay.
I was just following up to Anya's question in the chat, where can you include researcher if you haven't done the experience? And it's like, well,
Yes.
you've researched in sociology, so of course you can.
Yes. Yeah. Like the thing with LinkedIn headlines is the title you give yourself doesn't need to be the title that you currently hold. But like you can't just say I'm a user researcher, and like my sister who's a nurse can't just put user researcher and expect to get hired because she has no experience at all, right? But you are allowed to put whatever title you want, assuming that you're not lying. And yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you,
Yeah,
Sarah.
common sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And there's another question from Joanna. I would like to hear Sarah's opinion on CV parsers and ATSs. I don't know what an ATS is, Joanna. You might need to come on the mic and tell us. For someone transitioning from industry, I feel like my CV is hardly considered because of that.
All right. I am going to pull up because this one.
ATS is applicant tracking system, just
Yeah.
so everyone knows the acronym. Thank you.
So it's essentially a word that refers to the software that companies use behind the scenes to organize and manage candidates. That software might also be sophisticated enough for them to be like writing notes and sending emails and generating offers. I don't know, but that's essentially what we need to know. Now, in the chat, because I want to not forget this, January 21, I think. I am doing a workshop next Thursday all about how to stand out. That's my admin link. Wrong link. The correct link is in this bookmark right here. And then I have to copy this link. The workshop is all about, let me just edit it, how to create a resume that stands out and doesn't get lost in the applicant tracking system. So when people say, like, how do you quote, beat the applicant tracking system? There's this opinion / myth out there that like the applicant tracking system is deciding who gets the interview, and it's rejecting people, and it's not fair, and all this stuff. So similar to when you're recruiting participants for a research project, you might have things in a research, like a participant screener, that's what I call it. You might have things called knockout questions. And a knockout question essentially is a question to help you filter out who you do not want to participate in the research interviews. Like if I only want to talk to people in the United States and someone fills it out and they're from France, then we're going to reject them. It's just how it works, right? Same thing applies to when you're applying to a job. There may be questions on the application and rules in place that would reject you 10 minutes after you apply because the job description said people in XYZ countries or locations are eligible to apply, but you're not in those places because you didn't read the job description. And then you get upset and think you're a failure because you got the rejection, right? And so that's ATS in a nutshell. Now, what can we do to stand out? Number one, come to the workshop next week. But number two, if you can't, one of the mistakes that people make with their resumes is when you're filling out these online job applications and you're uploading your resume and it's clearly going into a software. I'm not familiar with the ones over there, but maybe it's universal, like Workday. I'm blanking on what they are, but anyway, there's all this ATS software, and that software can often, let me rephrase that. In order for that software to be able to parse, like read, skim your resume, having a 2-column resume often makes it difficult for that algorithm, whatever we want to call it, to like parse your resume because it doesn't understand where the column starts or stops. And so it might be like going left to right and reading a sentence, but it doesn't go back. It just keeps going when it hits a column. So then your resume gets all jumbled and your application might be like flagged or something or deemed, incomplete or who knows what. So don't have a 2-column resume. Now, we want to have 2 versions of our resume though. This 1-column version that you're going to use if you're clearly uploading it into some application software, but you still want to have what I like to call kind of a human-friendly version. I like a 2-column for human-friendly because the width of the columns makes it easier for our eyes to consume and scan the information, so that if like a recruiter emails you or messages you on LinkedIn and says, hey, can you send me your resume? Because that's a human, you might send them that human version. But some of the other mistakes are like using resumes that are overly designed with like emojis and graphics and like cutesy fonts and things. And you want to keep it simple and boring. The content is what matters most. The design of it matters too, but design really means like treatment of text, spacing, alignment, use of bullets, etc. It's not like showing the little logo you made for yourself and putting it at the top, even though it might be a nice logo. Don't put it. So yes, that's my rapid resume tips.
That's so helpful, Sarah. And yeah, I mean, we now have enough questions coming through that I've asked the people in the chat to please help each other with questions because there's so many questions that there's no way we can possibly get through them.
And
yeah, I think you've probably allayed people's fears with some of that. And I think it is very normal to have to create lots of different versions of your resume. So
yes.
Some people are feeling that wasn't normal, but it's very normal. So
yeah, and in the recap notes, because I have so many podcast episodes now on Spotify, I've made some playlists. So I have like the resume playlist and the LinkedIn playlist and this and that. So in the recap notes, I'll link to like this resume playlist so that it's probably going to hit on most of the questions that came up.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And we've helpfully Luciana has just added some links to
Nice.
your things in the chat as well. Thank you very much for doing that,
Thank
Luciana.
you.
So we have a question. I'm trying to think how many more we can get through in terms of, it's not a case of getting through them, but it's just I want to make sure you have enough time to actually sort of answer them as fully as you would like to. We are close to time. I think we can do two more questions. So I'm going to try and pick some folks who haven't had questions answered yet. So a question from Chantel is, what advice would you give to a product designer with a few years of experience who hasn't had the opportunity to do UX research in their role, but wants to transition to a new position or apply to a new job and feels they should have experience in that area by now?
Great question, and also common situation that a lot of people find themselves in. The first thing I would ask you to do is think about, like, are there opportunities to do research at your current company? Maybe you have an idea for some research that should be conducted that has not been conducted. So can you, even though there have not been research opportunities in the past, potentially, can you like start a research project on something that is not being researched? So finding opportunities to get that experience at your current job, I think, is ideal. If your boss says, like, no, you're not allowed to touch research, full stop, then we need to look elsewhere. And so this is where we get to this topic of, like, is it okay to put projects in your portfolio and on your resume that were not, quote, real world, right? Like at your job, for example. And what I hear from hiring managers is that, yes, they just want to see examples of you doing the thing that they are hiring for. Now, ideally, if you make up your own research project that you're going to do, you want it to be a real problem. And this is where a lot of people go wrong, because we've all seen the examples of people on Dribbble or Medium who just wake up one day and decide to redesign, Apple or Spotify or whatever. And it's just like this art project, essentially. What you want to do, especially because you're a researcher, is, I would say, like, for 5 days or an entire week, make a little note on your phone and document all the problems you encounter. And if you're like me, you'll have way too many than you know what to do with. And maybe you're taking photos too, right? Like, this parking thing on the street was so confusing. So then you're going to have this giant list of things that you could research. And if you pursue one of those, it's going to be really valuable. And for example, this one person in Career Strategy Lab, they had some type of hearing impairment, and they had this problem, and other people had this problem also, where if they were driving, they often could not hear emergency vehicles until they were like right up behind them, which is not ideal, right? So they thought to themselves, wow, this is an interesting problem, and I'm not the only one. And they ended up creating this entire research project around, like, how might vehicles and emergency services somehow make it easier for people who have hearing impairments to be aware that vehicles are, coming up behind them, for example. And that was really interesting because it wasn't just, oh, I redesigned Shopify or Spotify. There was such a compelling story around how this problem came to be. And they interviewed other people who had hearing impairments. They even somehow interviewed like a fire chief or some 911 operator or something like that, or, to learn more about the potential for solutions too. So that's my spiel on personal projects, if you will. Have a story behind it and like find the examples in your everyday life, and it's going to be far more well received than just, here's this redesign I did because I thought it would look cool.
So it's such a good point. I mean, certainly when I was working in education, that was how I created case studies, was there's so many problems you can solve when you're working with students. So, You know, it's great. I'm sure there's always opportunities in people's roles for sure.
Yes.
And we have a thank you in the chat for that, so that's lovely. The final
Wonderful.
question we will ask you is from Nicola. I will graduate from a boot camp in June. Any ideas for someone who is job hunting with just a 1-year boot camp and zero experience?
Yeah, I think this answer is a great opportunity to just kind of recap some of the things that we kind of went through today. So I think number one, relationships are so key. And I think start now. Like there's so many great people at this event, for example. So I would say start now when it comes to thinking about relationships and companies or industries that you are interested in or curious about or might want to apply to. That'll be number one. I think number two is really, really focus on your resume and your portfolio. And yes, you can put projects that you worked on during your boot camp in that portfolio. However, you really want to avoid this mistake I see a lot of people make where they try and just repurpose like a literal presentation that they made for their boot camp and translate it, like duplicate it and use it for their portfolio. And the reason that this becomes problematic is oftentimes those presentations that are created for boot camps somewhat sound like UX textbooks. And what I mean by that is oftentimes those presentations have lines like, next we did user research. Research helps us understand the needs of people and their problems, right? And the reader of your portfolio doesn't need you to define what a persona or what research or what an affinity map is or et cetera. They want to hear something like, next, we conducted usability tests to understand how people insert task name or why people get stuck in user flow, right? And so I think because recruiters and hiring managers, I see these posts all the time. They say they can spot portfolios of bootcamp people from a mile away. Part of it is because they often have these like textbook style language in them. So sure, you can repurpose maybe a presentation, but be very mindful that your case studies and the text in that portfolio is very much focused on what did you do? Why did you do it? What happened? How did that step inform the next step and not like a bunch of definitions type thing? And then the other thing, let's see, relationships, portfolio, resume. I'm trying to think of a third good takeaway. Oh, I think doing things to make yourself more visible to your quote customers, which are recruiters and hiring managers. Back to our product of you example, right? Like every product has customers. Companies at the end of the day are your customer. And so great companies are always marketing. They're always spending money. Even the companies that we all know, the names of their household names, they still spend money on marketing to stay visible. And so the best place, I really believe, love it or hate it, is LinkedIn, because that's where recruiters and hiring managers hang out. That's where people on their teams hang out. There may be small communities also, on Slack and Discord, et cetera. But when it comes to best reach for your time and effort, I think it's LinkedIn. So, after this workshop, maybe there's one or two session today, there's a couple of takeaways or something you could post, to help increase your visibility. And you don't need to post every day. Maybe it's just 3 times a week or something, or once a week with a podcast you listen to and a few takeaways. But visibility, visibility, visibility is a big one.
We've got some thank yous in the chat for that, Sarah.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. And I also, we've had some requests, to share some portfolio examples. What we can do, we'll save the chat after the call and we will see what we can do to assemble some resources in addition to yours, Sarah. We may well have some examples from the chapters that we can share. And then also, we have a worksheet from Ladies at UX Brighton that one of our senior co-organizers created, which is a checklist for creating case studies
Mm.
and portfolios, and it's super useful. So we can share that with all of you as a resource as well. So we should probably end there. Any final thoughts for us, Sarah?
Yes, this goes back to an article I wrote, which not many people have read yet, but I'm going to write it down. I wrote this article over the holidays all about why it's so important that we work in UX. It could apply to anyone, but the importance of having hobbies and interests outside of work. And I forget the exact title, but it's something like if you're unhappy in your UX or product role, it might be a sign that you need to get a life, essentially. And so part of the gist of the article is kind of goes back to resilience, like having things in our life, whether it's running marathons or in my case, skiing. I do a lot more skiing than I do running these days, but like having these hobbies just helps give me an outlet so I don't take work things so personally and let them like eat me up inside. And, if I get troll comments or something, having these other things to do just kind of helps diversify where I get my happiness from. So I will link that article because it's just this problem that I think exists, and it's really important to develop ourselves outside of work too. So that's one of my things for 2025.
Hear, hear. That is excellent advice. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much for your generosity and spending time with us today. We really appreciate it. And I know, based on all the comments and things that folks have said to me in person, how much we all appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. And I will compile that list and I'm going to get it to you in a few hours, but I'll get you the list of articles and such so we can send it out.
Amazing.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we will follow up with some notes and such. But we do encourage you to use the links that Luciana posted in the chat to connect with us. We'll from Brighton, we'll send a follow-up via Eventbrite email. But we also say, definitely join our Slack channel, definitely connect with our mailing list so that you get like useful tips. And we also have a job hunters group, which runs in Brighton, which is a weekly kind of group for people to get together and share tips for job hunting. So you can hear more about that as well. Any final thoughts from Stockholm and Amsterdam, if any Amsterdam folks are present?
We just want to thank you, Sarah. It was really insightful and we learned a lot. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for organizing this.
Thank you so much. So we will, me and the co-organizers will hang out for a moment just while everyone leaves, but have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.